I'm Alan Wartes, and this is Think Radio presents ThinkPlanet. My guest today is water law expert John McClow.
If you look at a graph of the storage in Lake Powell, it's shark's teeth, but the trend is down. There's no escaping that. You know, it goes up 1 year, down the next, up 1 year, down the next, or down 2 years, and up one, and up two, and down one. But if you draw a trend line from 2000 to 2018, it's down.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio.
ThinkPlanet is made possible by support from the Western Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability, empowering future change agents to foster ecologically resilient, economically sustainable, and socially just communities throughout the world.
If you like ThinkPlanet, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think People, a celebration of just how amazing people can be. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. My guest today is water law expert John McClow. McClow is a graduate of the University of Colorado and Colorado Law and has practiced law since 1973. He began representing the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District on water law matters in 1991 and became the organization's full-time general counsel in 2006. In short, over the past several decades, John McClow has been a key player in the world of water in the American West. He is currently a member of the Board of Directors of the Colorado Water Congress, is a former Upper Gunnison Basin Director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and an alternate commissioner on the Upper Colorado River Commission. McClow has represented Colorado in recent negotiations among Colorado River Basin states centered on an alarming and increasingly urgent issue: what to do about prolonged drought in the American West. John, thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome, Alan. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we've got so much ground to cover. This issue could consume hours and hours and hours of conversation. But I do want to take just a moment before we dive into the nuts and bolts to ask a question that's always of interest to me personally. Here you are, a leading water expert on such an important issue and such an important part of the country and really indeed the world. How'd you get here? Why?
Well, don't overstate my expertise, first of all, Alan, but I've worked for many years in this area, but I hesitate to call myself an expert. In any case, I came to Gunnison at the behest of Dick Bratton, a good friend and mentor who is still practicing law here in Gunnison. And he heard that I wanted to live in a small mountain town, and so I was at that time practicing in Denver and Boulder, and he recruited me down here.
And were you practicing water law from the get-go, or did that come later?
No, at that time, my practice only was about 20% water law, and the rest was commercial litigation and transactional real estate. But after I came to Gunnison, my practice gradually transitioned to become 100% water law, almost. I do other things for the district. I negotiate real estate transactions and that sort of thing, but basically it's water law now.
Right, and why? Why water of all things? What was it about that attracted you professionally?
The working for the district became a larger and larger portion of my practice, and I became more interested in it, and then it just became so much work that it precluded everything else, and I just do enjoy it very much.
Well, it's such a legendary and sort of storied pursuit. Water in the West. You say that, and it just evokes all these images of settlers, armed with guns and pitchforks and fighting each other over how the water comes down the creek. Has that been your professional experience? Would you categorize water issues in the American West still is pretty contentious and difficult?
Difficult, yes, and contentious, yes, at a certain level. But I think we're beyond the shovel handle stuff at this point now.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
How? Why?
Well, for one thing, it's an over-appropriated resource. There's very little left to fight over. All of the water, many will say, is already developed, and now it's just reallocating an overdeveloped resource. And so that requires negotiation and transactions. Secondly, we've become more sophisticated in water law and realize that confrontation is not as successful as negotiation. And so that's been the path for most water managers and water lawyers, water policy people for the last 20 years or so.
Well, I suppose we could hope that that's a trend that's playing itself out in other formerly contentious areas of society, this idea that it's in the long run easier to negotiate than to fight. And yet, we're here today. I was interested in talking with you because this issue of water has reached what many are calling a really critical stage in history. That surrounding what is becoming a historic drought, if not already historic, in the American Southwest, and what that has done to previous agreements and how things have been done for the past century or so. Can you bring us up to date before we really talk about why the system is being put to the test so severely these days? Let's take a primer in what this system really is and what it was intended to do. Beginning with the Colorado River Compact, I suppose.
All right. Well, that's a good place to begin. We all consider that the foundation of what we call the law of the Colorado River, the law of the river. As you do know, this Colorado River serves 7 states and the Republic of Mexico. Many millions of people, millions of acres of agriculture. I think 40 million is the current estimate of the number of people that receive water from the river for municipal and domestic use, and another 5 million acres of agriculture throughout those 7 states. So it's a major artery of the West. In the early 1900s, several states began litigating with each other over water rights and priorities in the rivers, not just the Colorado, but Colorado and Kansas argued, Colorado and Wyoming argued, and that means litigation in the Supreme Court. Colorado had a visionary state senator, lawyer, rancher by the name of Delph Carpenter. Carpenter realized that if some accommodation were not made, California, for example, was developing very quickly. And what the Supreme Court had said up to that point was, if you have a priority system within the state, you have a priority system between the states. And he was concerned that California would appropriate all of the river and the water in the Colorado River, and the slower developing upper basin states, such as Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, would be shut out.
And so appropriation then is the idea that if you're putting water to beneficial use, then you can stake a claim to it.
Exactly.
Okay, and so then, just to be clear, the basin that you're talking about, these 7 states, stretch all the way from Mexico to Colorado, to Utah, to Wyoming.
And so the headwaters of the Green River in Wyoming are the northernmost boundary, and the Gulf of California is.
And so the concern was, if you treated this whole thing as a unit, then thirsty users elsewhere could lock up water that we might have put to beneficial use here.
Correct. Thirsty users developing at a far greater pace than the upper basin states.
Okay.
So this is the prior appropriation system, also known as the Colorado Doctrine. First in time is first in right. If you divert water from the stream and place it to a beneficial use, first, that is the senior right. And senior rights must be satisfied before any junior right can divert at all. And so that's the risk. Carpenter persuaded the other states to join, and the United States and Congress approved the negotiation under one of the articles of the U.S. Constitution, and the 7 states sent their commissioners to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and on November 24th, 1922, they signed the Colorado River Compact. The essential elements of the compact are, first, it divides the beneficial consumptive use between the upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and the lower basin, California, Nevada, Arizona, each to have 7.5 million acre-feet of beneficial consumptive use per year.
And where did that number come from?
They had some hydrologic information that was developed from about 1890 to 1919, somewhere in that range. They had some gauge information on the river. It was unfortunately a very wet hydrologic period, and so they assumed at the time they may have had up to 20 million acre-feet per year to divide, and so they split it at 7.5 each, 15, so there would be some surplus. Didn't turn out to be accurate, but that's a different story. So the compact also allows the lower basin states to develop an additional 1 million acre-feet per year. It goes on to say that if ever we have an agreement with Mexico, the water that goes to Mexico will come from the surplus over the previous 2 allotments. And if there isn't a surplus, then each of the basins has to contribute equally to the deficit.
But they were fairly confident that there would be a surplus based on the numbers they had at the time.
I think that's a consensus. There are a few indications that Carpenter knew better. In some of of his correspondence at the time, he indicated he was thinking about reservoirs on the river to shore up the supply and that sort of thing. But by and large, I think it's generally agreed that the commissioners thought that they were dealing with more than 15 million acre-feet, more than 16 million acre-feet per year. The final imperative part of the compact says that the upper division states, and that's a geographic boundary, not a hydrologic boundary, cannot reduce the flow of the river at Lee Ferry below 75 million acre-feet in the aggregate over any consecutive 10-year period. So that averages to 7.5 million acre-feet per year. So there are some other provisions in the compact. It really is very short, but those are the principal ones that govern the allocation and distribution of the water in the river.
And in 1922, at development levels that existed then, 7.5 million acre-feet was a lot of water.
Yes, indeed.
Is there any indication that these commissioners had foresight enough to see a time when, even if the hydrology had proved to be completely accurate, that development might outpace that supply?
There are some indications, yes, but they didn't see that within a very long horizon, a very distant horizon. They indicated occasionally that they thought there might need to be some adjustments, but mostly they were thinking of adjusting up, not down.
Okay, well, that hasn't worked out very well.
No, it hasn't.
So what has happened since then? Take us through the chronology, because that's not the only document in the law of the river.
That's correct. If we just move chronologically, the next event would be the statute in 1928, Boulder Canyon Project Act of 1928, which authorized construction of Hoover Dam that created Lake Mead. It also authorized construction of the All-American Canal, which delivers water from the Colorado River to the Imperial Valley, which is the largest consumer of Colorado River water and also the senior water right. Previously, the water had been delivered there through a canal that diverted into Mexico, and the Mexicans were creating a lot of difficulties, and so the California farmers wanted an all-American canal. Congress agreed to build those two things for them, and that statute also allocated the 7.5 million acre-feet apportion to the lower basin among the 3 states, 4.4 million acre-feet to California, 2.8 million acre-feet to Arizona, and 300,000 acre-feet to Nevada. That's per year.
Okay.
Following that...
well, before we leave that, that's 1928. That's
Yes.
only 6 years after the compact was signed. They were already thinking of the need for a big dam like Hoover?
Well, that's something that the California, Arizona folks had wanted for many years, because at the time the Colorado River was untamed. And in a wet hydrology, that meant a lot of flooding and catastrophic events of that type. It had wiped out the diversion dam for the previous canal 2 or 3 times since 1890, because it would come surging down, and they wanted some control. Also was for the purpose of generating hydropower for the great and growing cities of Southern California. The original power plants at Hoover Dam were privately owned. They were individual power companies that developed those turbines, and then at a certain point they were turned over to the Bureau of Reclamation.
So clearly about more than just storage.
Yes. Storage was an option, but their main concern was controlling the river and generating hydropower.
Okay. So what's next?
After the 1928 statute, which, by the way, was the point at which Congress ratified the 1922 compact, Arizona refused to ratify it. So they changed the compact and the statute to say once it's ratified by 6 states and the United States, it will become effective.
Okay.
Arizona ultimately did ratify it in 1944.
What was their objection?
They just didn't feel they'd gotten a good deal. They didn't think their commissioner had negotiated a good enough deal for them.
Okay.
And they were also nervous about California's seniority. They didn't think that had been cleared up sufficiently. As history will develop, they didn't get the seniority anyway, but that was one of their concerns up to 1944. In 1944, the United States did sign a treaty with Mexico to allocate waters of the Colorado and the Rio Grande and the Tijuana River. The Colorado River portion said that the United States would deliver 1.5 million acre-feet per year to Mexico. In times of extraordinary drought, Mexico would take reductions in proportion to those reductions applied in the United States. And in times of extraordinary surplus, additional water could be delivered to Mexico, but not to exceed 1.7 million acre-feet per year.
And where did that amount come from?
Well, that's a good question. And it's a question of significant difference and debate among the states. But that
No
number,
shovel handles, though.
Well, no, not quite. But the ultimate decision on that came in 1968 from Congress, who directed the Secretary of Interior to come up with a plan on how to do that. So what he said was, we'll send each of the basins will be charged for half of it, 750,000 acre-feet, and then we'll send $7.5 million for the lower basin to meet that compact obligation. So basically it's currently being accounted for as coming half from the upper basin, half from the lower basin, the Mexican obligation. With one exception, well, without exception until 2010, when an earthquake changed the equation, the United States delivered that 1.5 million every year without fail. Fast forward then to 1948, and the upper division states were petitioning Congress for their own reservoir. And Congress said, well, you need to get better organized if we're going to build you reservoirs. So that's the genesis of the 1948 Upper Colorado River Compact among the 4 upper division states and Arizona. Arizona participates only because it has territory within the upper basin, but it gets an allocation off the top of 50,000 acre-feet per year. And the other 4 states, the states of the upper division, are allocated percentages.
So until then, this 7.5 million acre-feet that belonged to the upper basin states wasn't really apportioned? It was just
That's
sort of free-for-all, so to speak?
Well, today I think the upper basin has only developed about 4 million acre-feet. It's very small compared to the 7.5 it's entitled to. So there was not any issue about who gets what. They just took whatever they wanted and just made sure that the flow at Lee Ferry didn't decline below 7.5 million.
But the feds said, nah, we want it on paper.
We want to see that you states have agreed among yourselves about what your responsibilities will be under the 1922 Compact. And among some other things. You know, no federal project is that simple, but we'll try to condense this as you, as you requested.
Right.
The result is the 1956 Colorado River Storage Project Act, championed by our Congressman Wayne Aspinall. That act authorized the construction of 4 initial units, the big ones. Aspinall Unit, which was then called Curacanti, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam. That's the big bucket. And those were then constructed in the early 1960s. 1968, Arizona finally got federal authorization to build their dream project, which is the Central Arizona Project, a giant canal that diverts water from Lake Havasu and sends it all the way to Tucson through pumps and pipes and canals.
Feeds a lot of agriculture.
It does feed a lot of agriculture as well, and Tucson and Phoenix and some Indian tribes. So they divert about 1.5 million of their 2.8 million acre-foot allocation into that canal.
And this is a point for probably later in the conversation, but that's a fairly junior water right.
Well, that's the interesting thing I was going to point out about that priority. In order to get the votes in Congress to pass the 1968 Act, they had to concede that California had the senior priority and that they would be junior and take the shortages first if shortages ever became necessary. And consequently, they spent 12 years litigating that with California earlier, won the case, but in the end they lost because they couldn't get their bill through Congress to get the CAP. If
you want your canal, you've got to give
That's
on
correct.
this point.
Well, think of the ratio of legislators in California to Arizona in 1968.
Truly.
They were seriously outnumbered. So they had one very powerful senator in Arizona that managed to steer things through, but he still needed the votes. And so California gained that priority, which until this year they have maintained they will take no shortages under any circumstances. That has now changed, but that's further down the line.
I think so, because we're getting to the point of the conversation really with that statement that times are changing. There's this law of the river that has more or less rolled along, but something new is happening.
Well, the beginning of the new came in 2004. Actually, we had such good hydrology in the late 80s, early 90s that the states got together and negotiated with the Secretary of Interior surplus guidelines on how to manage surplus flows in the river, and they completed the guidelines in 2001. But then everything stopped. And that's 2000 is the last time those big reservoirs, Powell and Meade, were full. The storage levels plummeted, the inflows plummeted.
Really rapidly, too, right?
Very rapidly. And by 2004, the upper division states were beginning to be very concerned that Lake Powell was going to drop to unmanageable levels. And so they petitioned the Secretary of the Interior, then Gail Norton, to reduce the releases from Lake Powell. What had been the traditional release was that half the Mexican treaty obligation plus the 7.5 million. Footnote, the number is actually 8.23 because we get 20,000 acre-feet credit from the Paria River that comes in below Glen Canyon Dam. But the basic math is half the Mexican treaty obligation plus the 7.5 million. They said, you can't keep doing this. You're going to empty the reservoir. She said, well, I think even under the guidance of the 1968 Act, I have the authority to do that, but I'm not going to.
So they were asking her to supersede the compact, essentially?
No, the 1968 statute, which directs the Secretary on how to release water from Lake Powell.
I see.
The act that created the Central Arizona Project.
Right.
And that act is a little fuzzy, so it's possible that she had that authority. She said she did. Instead, she said, I want the states to sit down with reclamation and work this out among yourselves. Now, part of the reason that she did that, many of us believe, is because she saw the forecast for 2005, which was a significant uptick in inflows to Lake Powell.
Back to those surplus guidelines now.
And in fact, the inflows that year were 106% of the then 30-year average for the 2005 water year. So the crisis kind of slid off a little bit. But the parties did sit down and negotiate what are now called the Interim Shortage Guidelines. The title is much longer, but that's finally agreed on in December of 2007, which became then a record of decision from the Secretary of Interior, which then provides for the management of Lake Powell and Lake Mead based on the elevations in each of the reservoirs. And in August of each year, they look at the forecasted level of Lake Powell on January 1st, and they set an operating tier. But then they also check what Lake Mead looks like, and that causes some adjustments. And that formula determines what the annual release will be from Lake Powell.
Okay, so before we get too heavily into the details of all of that, let's talk about that philosophically for a minute, because it's a whole lot easier to set guidelines about how to deal with a surplus, who gets extra what, than it is to deal with how to share the pain. Is this kind of a historic sort of an agreement in your mind that these 7 basin states sat down and actually did that?
Yeah, well, it's definitely historic, no question, but they really had no choice because they were faced with continuing shortages. If you look at a graph of the storage in Lake Powell, it's shark's teeth, but the trend is down. Mm-hmm. There's no escaping that. Mm-hmm. You know, it goes up 1 year, down the next, up 1 year, down the next, or down 2 years, and up 1, and up 2, and down 1. But if you draw a trend line from 2000 to 2018, it's down. There really was no option other than litigation to sitting down and figuring out a way to equalize the reservoirs. That's the goal.
Well, and there was also Gail Norton's sort of famous statement of, if you guys can't work it out, then we will.
It's actually a 2.5-page letter, but that's the message.
Yeah. Essentially saying, look, this can become a federal issue if you can't reach agreement.
And that's anathema to the upper basin states. At the moment, the Secretary of Interior is, in fact, the river master in the lower basin because any water from the Colorado River is a release from Lake Mead, and the Bureau of Reclamation owns Lake Mead. If you want water from the Colorado River in the lower basin, you sign a contract with the reclamation. That's how you get it. So the Secretary is the river master. The Secretary has no such authority in the upper basin, and the states desperately want to retain control of their own destiny and not have the Secretary of the Interior become in any way the river master in the upper basin.
Well, how did the upper basin escape that with all of these reservoirs that were built here?
Because the water that we use is upstream of the reservoir.
Ah, okay.
And that's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, the lower basin has never known a shortage because they're downstream of their reservoir, and their 7.5 million comes out every year no matter what. Mm-hmm. The upper basin is in constant shortage because of Mother Nature. Occasionally, 2011, for example, we get a big surge. We've had that in 83, 84, for example. 95 was another year when we had big water. But we haven't developed our 7.5 million even close anyway. So all that surge goes downstream, and in 1983, Lake Powell almost spilled. It was so full. 2011, the release was not 8.23, it was 12 million because they had to get rid of it. So,
oh, boy.
So they live in a state of constant comfort in that sense. They have other problems.
Yeah, it's at least consistent.
Where the upper basin assumes all the hydrologic risk at this point. Because our 7.5 million just comes from whatever's left. And the inflows to Lake Powell have only exceeded the 30-year average 5 times since 2000. Now, the average changes every 10 years. And the 30-year average to 2010 was 11.83 million, the inflow. When we went to the next 10-year cycle, it went down to, it was 12 million that dropped down to 10.5 million, the 30-year average. When we moved from the 10 years ending in 1990, 10 years, ending in 2000 to the 10 years ending in 2010, that average even dropped. And we're still not getting average inflows very often. And when it's above average, it's maybe 109%, with the exception of 2011.
And so one of the really alarming things about that, you talk about this shark tooth graph that's trending downward, is that you can't just say, well, that's an anomaly that we're going to live through eventually and things will return to the way they were. Because climate modeling, in fact, predicts exactly that thing, exactly that trend. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're right about that. And many current water managers, scientists, hydrologists are no longer calling this a drought. This is now aridification. This is the new normal. A drought implies that it will get better, that this is a temporary state of affairs.
Sure.
Many hydrologists and scientists are saying this is not the case. This is going to stay this way for a long, long time. We shouldn't expect to come out of this with a big water year, or if so, that would be the anomaly. This is more like what we should expect, just like it is, in the future. Now, weather is not climate. So we do have variable weather, and some years we get more snow than others, and so it will always be a shark's tooth diagram. We'll have better years and worse years, but the trend line is going to continue to go down.
And so what that means, and I suspect that there are a lot of people who don't quite realize this, is that there's a floor to this thing. The trend line can't just continue to drop. There's this thing called functionality.
Correct.
At the big reservoirs.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, in the upper basin, we look at Lake Powell because that's our main bucket. Lake Powell holds 25 million acre feet. All right. An acre foot is about 326,000 gallons, just to give a scale. The Aspinall unit holds about 1 million acre feet. Flaming Gorge holds about 3.5 million acre feet. Navajo holds about 1.8 million acre feet when they're full. So clearly Lake Powell is our bank account. The others feed that, and we have some plans to make adjustments if we can in the future. But at Lake Powell, our crisis level is 3,525 feet above sea level. That's how we measure the storage in the big reservoirs, feet above mean sea level. 3,525 is our drop-dead number. Now, why is that so? Well, the minimum power pool at Lake Powell, that is the level at which they can continue to generate hydropower, is 3,490. We need a little bit of a cushion there because of the way the reservoirs function, the way the turbines function, and just the Bureau of Reclamation doesn't like to operate on a thread. If the reservoir drops below 3,490, no more power generation. That's a problem for two reasons. About 5.8 million people get power from the Western Area Power Administration grid. 80% of that comes from Glen Canyon Dam. Now, they don't get all of their power from there, but that many people get some power. It also generates $190,000 a year in power revenues. Those dollars pay for the Colorado River Storage Project. They pay the salaries, they pay the maintenance, they pay the operation. They also pay for several environmental programs.
Now, you said 190,000.
I meant million. I beg your pardon.
I was going to say.
Thank you.
Let's add a couple of zeros there.
Yeah, 190 million. Sorry, it is $190 million a year.
Yeah.
And they also pay for several environmental projects, the Salinity Control Program, the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, the San Juan River and Colorado River Endangered Species programs. All that goes away when the revenue disappears. Finally, as the reservoir declines below 3,490, and the only way to release water is through the bypass tubes, it becomes impossible to meet the compact obligation. We can't push enough water through the dam to get 7.5 million acre-feet to Leaf Area.
And the drop is significant. It's like cutting it in half, right? Something like that?
I would say, I think if we drop to 3,400, which is a big drop, the most they can release through the bypass tubes is about 3.5 million acre-feet, roughly half the compact obligation.
Yeah. So this is not a tighten your belt a little bit sort of moment.
Once it goes below 3,490, I think at 3,470 we can't meet the 7.5 million. It still can release water, but it can't release enough to prevent a compact deficit.
And so if I remember right, when in 2004 these negotiations really began, because everyone recognized this is not sustainable, the studies indicated that if those hydrological conditions continued, there's a 20% chance of dropping below 3,490.
Correct. If the hydrology from 2004 to 2014 were repeated from 2014 to 2020 or so, the reservoir would definitely drop below the minimum power pool. Fortunately, it wasn't quite that bad, but that's what got everybody excited in 2012.
Yeah.
12-13. And
because it was extraordinarily dry.
The one driest back-to-back period in our recorded history. Mm-hmm. The inflows to Lake Powell were very, very small.
And it hasn't recovered.
It has not recovered, no, except in 2011 we had gotten enough to boost it. So we had a new starting point that was a little higher, right? Mm-hmm. We survived the 2004 situation because we started with a full reservoir. In 2011, we got a big surge, huge water year, released 12 million acre-feet almost into the lower basin. But then it went down again, and it has come back up a little bit, but I think the current elevation is 3588, something on that order.
So
it's not a big way.
Not much cushion.
Lake Mead, the crisis level is 1075. Below that, they start taking shortages, even under the 07 guidelines. Mm-hmm. It's 1078 right now.
Okay, now run that by me again. The crisis level is?
In Lake Mead, it's 1075, 1,075 feet above sea level.
And we're 3 feet above that?
Correct.
You've been listening to part 1 of my interview with John McClow, water law expert in the American West. Tune in next week for the rest of the story on Think Radio Presents ThinkPlanet.